Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're just giving a little minute for people to join, so just bear with us a moment. We'll be starting very, very soon. Perfect. All right, thank you very much. So hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to our panelists and to our audience for today's Fighting Ransomware in a Web3 World webinar. My name is Natalie Hall and I'm Marketing Director at Merkle Science. For those of you who don't know us, Merkle Science provides crypto risk and mitigation and compliance solutions to crypto native businesses, DeFi participants, financial institutions, and government agencies around the world. But why are we here today? So to say that ransomware attacks and how to respond to them is a hot topic for businesses in every geography would be a huge understatement. These attacks, hacks, and other forms of crypto crime are becoming as commonplace as they are catastrophic for their victims, with over $600 million worth of ransomware payments made in 2021 alone. And the impact of this isn't just limited to the companies under attack. These events have a measurable, detrimental effect on consumers and credibility, and also the profitability of industries, and beyond that, the macroeconomy as well. Therefore, I'm really delighted to be joined by today's panel of experts as we explore the tools, tactics, and technologies that can help your business prevent these events, mitigate risk, and protect consumers. So before we jump in, a little bit of housekeeping. Our conversation today is being recorded and made available to all participants and registrants after the event. Please feel free to pop any comments, any questions in the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. And as we go along, we'll try and answer as many as we can, but beyond that, we'll leave a little bit of time if we can at the end for Q&A. So to begin, first and foremost, I'd like to invite our panel to introduce themselves. So David, starting with you.
Hello, thanks, Natalie. Hi, my name is David Suzuki. I'm the Managing Director of Risk and Investigations for Black Panda. I concurrently lead Black Panda's business in Japan, Philippines, and India. So yeah, Black Panda is a specialist cyber incident response company and digital forensics company. That is our hyper focus, but we do have a specialized corporate risk and investigations practice to support fraud recovery, and criminal prosecution and civil litigation claims with a view to recovering funds that are stolen through various means. We're headquartered in Asia. Singapore is our headquarters. We have a sort of a smaller headquarters or sub-headquarters, I should say, in Hong Kong, with offices also in Tokyo, Manila, and then we are planning to open offices in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia this year. So yeah, that's kind of the long and short of Black Panda and what I do for the firm. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Natalie. Chris Recker, Senior Associate at Dwayne Morris. I'm the lawyer, very much for my sins, and everyone can be bored now as we all have a habit of talking too much. I sit within the fraud and investigations team at Dwayne Morris. So we're a US firm headquartered in Philadelphia, offices all over the US, London, which is where I'm based out of, and then over in the Far East. My day-to-day work involves helping victims and those accused of wrongdoing either to recover losses or to defend those claims and investigations as required. A large part of my workload involves dealing both with cybersecurity related issues, so everything including ransomware investigations, major incident response, business email compromise, fraud, and everything around that. And actually, an even larger portion relates to digital assets. So that's everything from asset recovery, where cryptocurrency is the mechanism for making for the transfer of the fraud money, or as a mechanism for moving money away, all the way through to complex investment schemes, romance scams, everything in between for clients all over the world, which often involves coordinating and quarterbacking litigation in various parts and in lots of places at the same time. We also assist with things like regulatory perimeter assessments and on the advisory side for those types of businesses. So we see all sides of the crypto and digital asset sphere as well, which adds a different dimension, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yeah, absolutely. Dealing with the things that we're going to talk about a lot today, and there's certainly a lot for you to go at just now. Pazzi, over to you.
Thank you. So now my name is Pasi Koistinen. I work at CoinHacko as a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. So maybe you could think of me as the blue team, the defender kind of a team leader here. CoinHacko is a Singaporean company. I'm in Singapore as well. We are basically a cryptocurrency exchange or digital asset exchange. We recently actually got a full digital payment license here in Singapore, provided by the MAS, Monetary Authority of Singapore. So something to be really proud of. And I think that's about it, about us and me. Over to you. Back to you, Natalie.
And last but not least, my colleague Ian.
Thanks, Natalie. Thank you everybody for attending today's session. My name is Ian, and I'm proud to say that I'm part of the founding team at Merkle Science, where I currently serve as Director of Partnerships. And prior to joining Merkle Science, I started my career more in the traditional sense, where I used to be a lawyer, not unlike Chris, although nothing as exciting as what he's doing. I think if I had the opportunity to do what he's doing, I'd probably stay in practice a little bit longer. But thankfully, I moved into the crypto space in 2018, and haven't looked back since. And today, very excited to take my knowledge in navigating legal and regulatory issues and helping companies solve their compliance and investigation problems. So happy to be part of today's panel. Back to you, Natalie.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. So David, we want to start with you today. So can you describe a typical ransomware attack for the audience who may be less familiar?
Sure. Okay, I'll answer that question, but first I'd like to address a very big common misconception. So ransomware, actually, it's not an IT problem on a fundamental level, okay? It's a security problem, fundamentally, because it is not a machine that is attacking you. It is a human threat actor that's using a machine to attack you, right? So the threat actor could be a criminal, could be a malicious state actor, could be a terrorist. But make no mistake, it is a human being that is attacking you. I mean, cyber is just another domain, right? So you have attacks in the physical world, you have kidnappings in the physical world. Ransomware attacks are the same thing fundamentally, but it's just that the domain is in cyber as opposed to physical. So that is something that I think I'd like to make very clear. I believe the misconception exists because it's one of those things that it's abundantly clear, but maybe that's because, and maybe that's why people miss it, because it's too close. So yeah, I just wanted to address that right off the bat.
That's really helpful. And actually just one more misconception that you could perhaps help to address. So oftentimes ransomware is synonymous with crypto, and actually it's not just crypto, and it'd be interesting to understand what the balance is from your side.
Yeah, so well, I think in terms of and I think this will be addressed later on in this conversation, but cryptocurrency plays a big role in ransomware demands, demands made by the threat actor for payment. And I think in recent years, it's almost 100% cryptocurrency as the mode of transaction, or the currency of transaction, if you will. I can walk through some historical, I guess, characteristics of payment and the currencies or the mode of payment going back to 1989. Initially it started off as ransomware attacks started off using infected floppy disks, and the demand would be to pay the ransom by check. So you would mail a check. This is back in 1989, right? And then several years later, it became a little bit more sophisticated technologically. You would have to go on tour to make the payment, things like that. And then later on, PayPal became a popular mode of transacting. And then now, in recent years, we see cryptocurrency demands for payment in cryptocurrency. So that's kind of the evolution, I guess, in terms of the mode of transacting.
For sure. And so what typically would someone today experience during a ransomware attack?
Yeah, so I think maybe I could use a slide to kind of illustrate kind of what happens in attack and kind of the process in terms of dealing with it. So I'm wondering if I could get that the slide shared, if that's okay.
Yes, certainly. You can go ahead and share.
All right, can everybody see my screen?
Just coming, we're hoping. Yeah, we're there.
Great. Okay, so there are various ways that a ransomware threat actor will try to get in. A common way, and it's not the only way, but a very common way in is to RDP in, remote desktop protocol in. So there would be maybe an open port or something that is exploitable for the threat actor to get in. Initially, the threat actor may just deploy a very light malware to collect intelligence. It may look for other vulnerabilities, other ways in, right? That would then be exploited later on. There are, other things that the initial light payload can do, like, it could deploy password stealing software, malware, and then, this is all done with a view to gaining elevated privileges in an endpoint or I mean, in the IT environment of a target. So, it's really just, a graded process. It goes in steps where, initially the malware may be just collecting intelligence, looking for other vulnerabilities. Then, later on, it will escalate access to other critical parts of the IT environment. It may target endpoints that have the most critical data, might prioritize those, and then finally deploy a bigger payload. And there are different types of ransomware, as some of you may know. There's ransomware that encrypts files. It can, ransomware that locks your screen.
Mm-hmm.
Ransomware that targets kind of the boot, sort of the brains of the computer. Target other things like the web server or browser. It locks it. It could go after mobile phone applications. So typically around five different types that we see. Just to recap, file encryption, screen lock, master boot record, which is the brains of the system, web server or browser lock, and then targeting mobile phone applications. Yeah, so just if I may flash that slide again, and I'll finish up. I promise it won't take too long. We see here in the first stage, of a ransomware response, typically our incident response specialists would come in, and the first thing they do, and this is very important, the first thing you want to do when you're responding to a ransomware attack is to increase your security. Increase your security. And what I mean by that is conduct the root cause analysis, find out how they got in, right? You want to patch that gap. Very important, critical. And then you also want to make sure that the endpoint or larger IT environment is sweep clean of other, threats, malware. There's often, I guess, a tendency for IT teams who are not trained cyber incident responders to, to back up, data, but you might be backing up malware with that in that process, right? So that exposes you to elevated risk again. So very important for professional incident responders to come in, increase the security, conduct root cause analysis, plug the gaps, and then just sweep, do a deep forensic sweep of the endpoint and larger endpoints and larger IT environment to make sure that your security is at, as high as it can be. So that's really step one. So I'll just pause there. Yeah.
That's really helpful, David. Thank you. And I'm interested to know from yourself and from Pasi, in terms of communication, once you've secured the environment as best as possible in the event of attack, how does the communication program work both internally and externally for victims of these events? Pasi, maybe over to you for that one.
Right. So there's definitely a lot of different stakeholders who are affected by these attacks, both internal and external. If you're looking at it from a defender's point of view, you typically have the IT folks and the security folks running around in the first phase trying to find out what happened. And then the next phase is that the top management is coming after them. And unless you have that crisis management, crisis communication structure, where you have your response team and you have your management team or crisis communications team separately, to the teams of people who don't interfere with each other's work. If you don't have that exercise in place in your procedures, policies, it's not going to work. So you have to have the peace and quiet for the folks who are actually doing the recovery, and you have to have the peace and quiet for the folks who are facing outwards with the comms team, CEO, and others who are speaking to the customers, the regulators, and whomever is a stakeholder in this incident. In some cases, I've seen, unfortunately, billion-dollar businesses being stopped by these incidents. Nothing works for, in worst cases, months, and you can just hear the sound of the cash machine running, or actually not running the way it should be. And I have all the sympathies for these guys who are managing these incidents. If they don't have the structure in place, it's not going to work.
100%. Yeah, and I think that the harm is so pervasive as well across all of the organization, and getting the communication right is absolutely important, both in terms of internal and external. I think, Chris, the question that always jumps to people's minds are, do we pay the ransom? If so, how do we pay? What is the best practice in this instance to, the concern, I think, is always getting business running and the cash registers, as Pasi has said, ticking over again as quickly as possible. But I think it's very opaque for people as to whether or not they should pay, and if so, how. So it'd be great if you can cast some light on that for the audience.
Yeah, it's a really difficult decision, I think, and it's conversations that we've had to have with lots of clients over the years. And ultimately there are lots of different factors in favor of paying or not paying. And as lawyers, we can't advise a business to make that payment. We can make them aware of the commercial implications and potentially the criminal implications of making that payment, and then there are other third parties that can help with the facilitation of it. But ultimately, the big picture points tend to be around the morality of making that payment. Should you be condoning the paying of ransoms, and that is something that for organizations that have prepared as part of this process, they may have already considered that in the event of ransomware that they're never going to pay. And if you've already got that stance, then you know that you're not going to have to go through this type of analysis. But equally, you can imagine if the cash registers are off, it's bleeding and not working, is bleeding the business dry. If the C-suite can see that there is a sum of money that they can pay in theory to make this stop, that actually making that payment could be very attractive. Another factor that's often not considered is how that goes down with not just your stakeholders. So let's assume that this all gets out. Let's assume that everybody knows that you made this payment or didn't make this payment, whatever the decision might be. Is that something that you think your stakeholders would have expected you to do or not do? And not just stakeholders though, what about your employees? And we're talking here specifically about an event which stops the business from operating. But imagine that you're in a scenario where, in addition to this, you have the extraction of data. So you then have potential risks to data subjects. Would your employees, would your stakeholders expect you in those circumstances to do something to protect them? And that's a really interesting debate as well, and something that needs to be considered. And that needs to be considered specifically, I think, with PR teams. So we'll talk a bit later on, I think, about the makeup of that response team and what that looks like. But ultimately, how is that going to land more generally if this gets out? Either way is a big factor. But often what's not thought about as part of this is the fact that in some jurisdictions, making that payment might need to be reported, and equally might be a criminal offence. So generally speaking, under English law, there isn't an offence of paying a ransom as such, but you can be inadvertently being caught up in a money laundering offence if you facilitate an arrangement that leads to money laundering, and you want to be very careful that you're not paying or making funds available to a sanctioned entity. And those rules differ all over the world, and in some jurisdictions it's strict liability, in others that it's not. But certainly in England, the rules all hinge around knowledge. So this is where engagement with Black Panda, engagement with Merkle Science, and the key people that are part of the response team is so important, because actually what you do is you identify the information that is available about that address, because in reality we're not talking about sending a check in the post anymore, although I'd love to see if somebody tried to do that now. We're talking about making probably a Bitcoin transaction to an address that in reality we may not know who controls it. But from things like knowing the strain of the ransomware, we might know which threat actor is behind that. We may know, is their MO to release the data? Is this actually going to work? We may know that they're connected to terrorism or not. And again, that's another factor that needs to be considered. And it all comes down to knowledge. So that's something that is really important. How you actually facilitate it, there are third parties out there that can help with running those checks in addition to the ones that will be done by Merkle Science and Black Panda, and can facilitate the transfer. Because the other factor here, and again, I've had this conversation with lots of clients, is even if you want to pay, do you know how to pay? Do you have a cryptocurrency address? Do you know how to convert several £million potentially in, or whatever the currency might be, into Bitcoin and then make this transaction? So there's all sorts of factors around that, and there are people that can help, and it all comes down to taking advice. But if you pay the ransom, the other factor then, well, I guess the big questions are, what happens? What happens if you do pay? And what happens about recovery after? And that's something, again, that is a big thing that we're going to talk about here. I know that Ian can talk and speak to the information that's available on, as part of a blockchain analysis. And from our perspective, recovering that ransom payment in some circumstances after it's been paid could be a very viable strategy. And it's something we'll talk more about in a little bit. And it's something that I think isn't done enough, if you ask me. And I think one of the reasons that it's not done enough is because if you're in this scenario, there is and your organization is literally brought to its knees by the malware, and they can't operate. They've got people, they've got problems every direction. If if they are able to get access to their files and restart working again, essentially, does essentially trying to recover that ransom payment from the threat actors equal the equivalent of kicking a hornet's nest? You just got back off the hook. Is that if you try and do something straight away, are you at risk of being infected again? Are you at risk of being targeted again? And there are all sorts of tactical considerations around that, but certainly later down the line, it's absolutely viable. And there's all sorts of different strategies that can be deployed. Some initial thoughts there.
That's really helpful, Chris. And I think this is what makes these attacks so pernicious, is that they really are at the confluence of legal responsibility, a moral responsibility, commercial responsibility in terms of getting your company moving again. And therefore it makes it incredibly difficult to make the right decision in some cases. But you touched on a really interesting point that I want to turn to Ian, in that some jurisdictions that there is a legal liability if you elect to pay the ransom to people who are illicit actors, whether it's money laundering or worse. In what role can blockchain analytics play to help give some clarity to businesses trying to make a very difficult decision at an incredibly pressurized time?
Yeah, happy to jump in and share. But before I did, I actually first wanted to maybe touch on something that was asked before as to, what role does crypto play and why is cryptocurrency, oftentimes talked about hand in hand with ransomware. And I think like David mentioned, the way that crypto plays into ransomware attacks today is it's typically the preferred means that, these threat actors ask for payments. And the reason is, of course, because of some of the characteristics of cryptocurrency transactions, right? Like what David mentioned in the past, it was very difficult for people to make online transactions. If you wanted to, make a payment through PayPal, make a payment through a bank transfer, there's oftentimes going to be a need for you to interact with a financial institution, which is regulated, right? And no criminal wants to disclose their identity, use a regulated financial institution where there's a trail, right, that, states the payment has been made. Whereas now with crypto, criminals now have a means of accepting payments without disclosing anything personal about themselves. The ease in which criminals can create any wallet address today, it's ridiculous, really, if you think about it, right? They can create as many as they want, and they can, use that in order to receive payment from basically anywhere in the world. And all of this can be done without, again, any party having to disclose themselves. Now, all that being said, although these characteristics of blockchain makes cryptocurrency a preferred means of payment, it's undeniable that there are other characteristics of blockchain that also makes such transactions, for lack of a better word, preferred from a law enforcement perspective, because it provides us with so much more data to analyze. As more and more ransomware incidents involve crypto, we definitely have been seeing an uptick in interest from people contacting us, asking us to help with recovery. And this is where Merkle Science typically comes in on the crypto tracing and forensic sides, where we then partner with companies like Black Panda, who specialize in more full suite cyber crime, right, in order to provide assistance in tracing. And typically, where we come in is to either help with providing insight as to where these assets have gone in order to retrieve them, or oftentimes failing that, it's about what information can we provide to help identify the organization behind the incident. And one of the great things about blockchain is that it provides this immutable record of every single transaction ever conducted, right? And all this information can be seen by not just us, but by anybody in the public space with access to the internet. And so we live in an interesting world where today, when a crime happens, we can actually use the blockchain to go in and take a look at all the historic transactions that was done by the criminal involved or the threat actor involved, and use those additional information and links and data points to help us tie a real-world identity to an account. Now, the trouble, though, of course, is that this is typically done by us looking for interactions with, let's say, an exchange that has hopefully done KYC. And I'm glad to say that in recent years, with regulations kicking in, we are seeing more and more jurisdictions coming in with licensing frameworks that mandate these companies to do KYC. But unfortunately, it's just not being done fast enough. And so one of the other trickier problems that we face is, getting information from these companies itself can be a challenge. And this is something that I think Chris can probably speak to in a lot more detail later on when we talk about some of the legal issues and challenges that, investigators face. But yeah, I think, as much as there's also this misconception that crypto is anonymous, it's untraceable, I think everyone on this call can test that it's not true. In fact, if you ask some law enforcement officers today, at least those that are well trained in crypto investigations, they may even say they prefer criminals to do their crime using Bitcoin than cash. Yeah.
I definitely prefer it for what it's worth. I think there's so much information that's built on that. You have the blockchain and non-blockchain clues and investigatory techniques. In the right hands, you can identify people easier than you can through the banking system and quicker. I'm with you.
100%, 100%. Thank you so much, Ian. So I think maybe let's take a step back then. So we talked about what happens in the event of such an attack, but how do you create a resilient or a ransomware resilient system and infrastructure within your business that's going to put you both in a place to prevent such attacks, but also to respond properly in the event that they do occur? And maybe I'll hand, David, first of all, back to you on that particular topic, as to how really companies can prepare themselves well.
Yeah, sure. So I think it all goes back to the fundamental kind of understanding of what ransomware and other types of malware are, right? Really, it's fundamentally a security problem. So organizations should understand this and design their security posture or their incident response preparedness around this understanding. So that can be things like training personnel to look out for certain things, to understand the attack vectors, making sure that in an IT environment that your security posture is robust, that you're not leaving any open ports, right, accessible to a threat actor, that you're another common attack vector is through phishing links, right? So you want to educate your staff, not to click on suspicious phishing links. There are other vectors as well, like malvertising, for example, right? So you got to be very conscientious in educating your workforce, your personnel. So it starts with education, I think, at the most fundamental level, and understanding that it's a security issue, not an IT issue. And unfortunately, we've seen too many cases out here in Asia where the IT department of a target organization is thrown under the bus. They're blamed for not having stopped the attack, right? But you can't blame them because, as I say, it's not an IT problem. You really need to understand that there are, these vectors. It happens to, utilize cyber means, but if you do understand fundamentally that it's a security problem, then you can educate your personnel accordingly to, enable them to understand, and identify the threat vectors and to stop them in their tracks. So again, don't click on phishing links. Don't, scroll over malvertising. Don't, be susceptible to social engineering, because a lot of it comes in through the human risk element as well, right? Where maybe somebody inside an organization is unwittingly compromised by a threat actor, into providing access, right? That's another very common vector. So, these types of things, it's essential that, that policies are put in place, that education is, delivered to the workforce.
Absolutely. That's really helpful, David. Thank you. And I think once you have that education in place, Pasi, you talked earlier in the call about creating the space and the quiet for compliance teams and tech teams to respond to these type of events. What does that look like in practice?
In practice, it means that you need to have that capability somewhere to do the first response, be it in-house or outsourced. If you're a smaller company, probably outsourced. If a larger one, then you may have your own resources. And this means quite security conscious guys, probably a SOC, Security Operations Center kind of a team. If we're talking about an outsourced company, it could be a MSSP, managed security service provider, or you can run something like that in-house. In any case, I would say that the IT organization or somewhere around it should have this capability and a team for this purpose. And it's not just ransomware, but all kinds of security threats that they face. Let's take a lively example from our life. As a crypto exchange, we see a lot of different kinds of spear phishing, whale phishing, phone smishing, and other phishing types of attacks almost daily. And some of them are good, well made. Some are not so well made. Sometimes we see things that are really hard to avoid. And it's always that the user is in the center of all of that. And our main focus is therefore to first educate the behaviors of users in our organization. But having said that, we can't just rely on succeeding every time, every day, everywhere, because humans are humans, and we should give them the benefit of doubt. You know, somebody can make a mistake sometimes. Okay, let's give it to ourselves. We are not perfect. So then we also need those tools that are monitoring and preventing those malware and ransomware, in this case, attacks from proceeding from initial infection to something worse. Yeah, so you need a team of specialists, and when something happens, something major, an incident, for example, you may need to set up a separate team just for that incident alone, and choose the right person on board of that. And it might be a mix of security and IT people who do the recovery. Usually is.
Absolutely. That's really helpful, Pasi. Thank you. And then Chris, from your perspective, you know, obviously you looked at outside partners, as Pasi had mentioned, whether it's security partners or indeed law firms, insurers, or blockchain analytics firms like Merkle. What role do you and your team play, and what advice would you give to a company looking to set up a system that's prepared for such an attack?
Yeah, I think preparation is absolutely the word. You know, prevention is better than cure. The better prepared an organization is, the better they're able to respond. So in an ideal world, whoever their preferred vendors might be, the organization will know who they are. It will all be written into a response plan. This is blue sky thinking on my part, not always how it works. But you have everybody onboarded. You would know who to call, how to escalate, and you would even probably have a copy of that printed out and put in a drawer, because if people forget that in the event that there is a major incident, they may not be able to access all of their files, and so the response plan may not be visible or may not be accessible, so they won't necessarily know what that entire protocol is. So what does that look like, and what role do we have? And for me, the response prong, the response team has several components. So you have the legal, the PR, the cyber, and the technical side. So on the cyber and technical side, that's everything that Pasi and David were saying. It's about having those people that not just come in and do the external analysis and help manage the incident, but work with the organization's internal resources as well, who know the network, and support them in that journey and help them to make sure that all the right steps are being followed. It's also a really important time to involve the blockchain tracing, the blockchain tracing team, to involve Ian and Merkle Science, because actually that's when we can already start to build our assessment of what's going on. PR is often not thought about here, but as I mentioned earlier, the comms, not just when you're talking about paying a ransom payment, but actually let's say you can't communicate with your suppliers, let's say you can't get orders out, let's say you've got employees who are worried about what's gone on. In that scenario, you need to have clear messaging, you need to have consistent messaging, and you need to make sure that everything that's being said, you have to assume that it's going to be seen by the regulator and by third parties, but actually you want to make sure that you're not giving more than you need to. But on the other hand, making sure that you're not favouring one party over another, particularly when you're talking about regulators in different jurisdictions who might have different thresholds. So if you report so much to one and then more to another, if they end up communicating and find out that you've shared more, that might not be viewed favourably either. So there's all sorts of factors that need to be considered there. But on the legal side, what do we do? Why is it important to bring lawyers in? Well, first of all, lawyers are often brought in through insurance notifications. So cyber insurance is a really important piece of the puzzle, and it's something that I think is more prevalent now. Lots more organisations have that type of insurance, and it provides connections to and often introductions to key specialists when these incidents happen. You don't always have to use those providers if they're not on panel, but they're available, so you do have a resource. But on the legal side, the benefit of having a lawyer involved is legal professional privilege. So the answer here is, by having the lawyer involved, the reports that are created, the information that is learned, everything that's documented that relates to the incident, it can be generally speaking, wrapped up in legal advice or litigation privilege, which means that you have control over whether or not those reports, those internal emails, everything relevant to it need to be disclosed. And without the lawyer involved, then those emails almost certainly will be disclosable if they're relevant. And so the emails that say things like, well, this isn't my fault, this is this person's fault because they didn't do their job, suddenly all of that is disclosable. Now, I'm not saying that the email, just by involving a lawyer, doesn't mean that email might not need to be disclosed, but you can, the sooner the lawyer's involved, the sooner the lawyer can say, don't send emails like that. That's assume that it may be seen later down the line.
Sure.
The other factor, and looking at the other side of the coin with that, is around the wider piece that's often forgotten about. So contractual review, review of the key contracts that are involved or affected, because sometimes those contracts have notification provisions that say, in the event of, and it doesn't just say data breach, for example, some of them will say cybersecurity incidents, cyber incidents, security incidents. They will have wide drafted language, require notifications to those counterparties. And then inevitably what that means is that that party then comes in and wants a call with their security team, their lawyers, and then your lawyers and your security team. And they want information about what's gone on, whether or not their information is affected. The investigation might still be ongoing, so you might want to share something, but not enough. And then on top of all of that, you've also got potential requirements to notify to regulators in the event there have been data breaches, or in the event that you're a regulated entity, you might have to notify to your regulator, and helping through that process too, and helping to answer those questions. But in a roundabout way, hopefully that gives an idea of, I suppose, what the role that we play in those incidents.
That's really helpful. And I think just passing back to David, you had a slide that just shows the anatomy of that process and how Merkle and Dwayne Morris and Black Panda often work together. So yeah, it'd be great to see that. And then maybe Ian, you can just give a bit more color on how Merkle supports this process.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So, yeah, I think Passy, Ian, and Chris raise a lot of interesting points. And points around compliance. Having a robust plan in place, having specialist responders. So, I mean, this all indicates that in a ransomware response, it's extremely important to have a multidisciplinary response capability. You've got the PR, the legal, the technical incident response and digital forensics. So these are all very important. And even within our own role, we have an integrated response suite here, as you can see here. Step one, as I mentioned before, increase your security, conduct the root cause analysis, plug the gaps, do a forensic sweep of your systems, make sure it's clean, eradicate the malware, and remediate the situation. That's from a technical perspective. But at the same time, you want to make sure in the event that the team is unable to decrypt files, let's say, for example, and I would say in many cases, it's not possible to decrypt encrypted files. So you want to have the option. You want to have other options, right? In terms of resolving the incident. So we also have a parallel track here in the early stages of a response, whereby we engage with a threat actor in negotiation. Actually, to be precise, we advise the victim, the client, how to negotiate with the threat actor. So one of the most important objectives of the negotiation phase or process is to create more time, to extend the time. Like if a threat actor is demanding that you pay by the end of the day, you want to extend that timeline in order to give the incident response team, working on the technical aspect, more time to, decrypt the files, for example, let's say. The other thing you want to do is make sure that the threat actor actually does have the data and they can decrypt it. So, this is what we call a proof of life exercise. The concept is exactly the same as what you see in a kidnap and ransom response incident, proof of life. You want to make sure that the hostage is alive, right? So similarly, in a ransomware response incident, you want to make sure that the data can be decrypted, can be returned to you. And so we make sure in engaging with the threat actor, we have a process whereby we can confirm that, whether or not the threat actor has your data and can decrypt it and return it to you. So another aspect of the negotiation is, of course, we try to negotiate or advise the victim or customer so that they can bring the price demanded down. We've seen in our data, in our research, actually from our own files and also through open source research, that the amounts demanded can be brought down by 70% in many cases. So that's quite significant, right? So instead of paying 100, let's say $1 million, you're only paying 300,000, for example, let's say. So that is also very important. So I guess in short, the ransom response, having this multidisciplinary approach with the technical and also the negotiation, you want to create an environment where it's secure to affect, let's say, a ransomware payment, right? You want to be compliant as well. So we do have the capability of, conducting due diligence on the threat actors to ensure that, they're not a sanctioned entity, for example. We work closely in this process with, the likes of Duane Morris to make sure that, these payments, if the customer does make a decision to pay, that it's done in a secure and compliant manner. Yeah, so, I just wanted to kind of raise these points just to kind of, I suppose, underscore, the importance of what my co-panelists raised earlier. Yeah.
That's really helpful. And I'll maybe go to Chris and then to Ian. So Chris, you mentioned the importance of insurance and that perhaps it's not as well used as it could be in this particular space. So it would be great if you can elaborate a little bit on that as part of that framework that potentially companies are building.
Yeah, I think insurance is cyber insurance and insurance to cover these types of risks is so important. And I think there are lots of organizations out there that assume that they have this cover and should be checking with their brokers to make sure that not only they have the cover that would deal with this type of incident, but that actually the limits, and particularly the business interruption limits, are what they need to be, so that in the event of a problem and in the event of claims, in the event of whatever needs to happen, that they can carry on trading, and this doesn't absolutely eradicate their finances. Because if ultimately they can recover, but the business has no money and ends up going into liquidation, then somebody said to me very recently, what's the point? What ultimately is the point? There are panel firms out there that are appointed by insurers and can be appointed by insurers, and they are all very good, not doing them down at all. They are very good at what they do. They do this day in, day out. Often an insured will have a choice as to instructing their own lawyers, their own cybersecurity experts, their own blockchain tracers. And in practice, what happens is those parties will agree fees with the insurer separately so that the engagement can continue. And then the insurers are kept up to date in the appropriate way. I think there's a shift in the market about the payment of ransoms and whether or not that is something that is insurable more generally. And I think that we will start to see developments in the industry, and certainly what I'm hearing is that certain insurers may not provide cover unless there is monitoring software that's deployed on somebody's network and on somebody's environment, and they may not insure ransom payments, or they'll only insure up to a very small number. So ultimately, and on top of all of this, if an organization has got insurance, it still has obligations to act as if it were a prudent uninsured. It can't just go, well, I've got insurance, so I'm just going to pay everything. It has to make decisions in a reasonable way. And so ultimately, an organization should work on the basis that everything that is paid out is going to be paid by them. And if their insurance covers it, then wonderful. But if it doesn't, then who's left carrying the can? It's the organization. So I think insurance is the market is hugely developed, and I think with the right knowledge base, I think there will be strategies for recovering those ransom payments as well, to help and support the insurers and the third parties there.
That's really helpful, Chris. Thank you. And Ian, I just wanted to bring to your attention a question from the audience. So the question is, OFAC have recently sanctioned a crypto mixer used for money laundering by other sanctioned targets, and ransomware operators also use such mixers. Do you think that ransomware operators themselves will be sanctioned anytime soon? And why have they not been sanctioned already? Is it on purpose to enable ransom payments so as to not be sanctions evasion?
Oh, interesting question. So, well, first of all, I do want to point out that there's definitely not an intent to not sanction ransomware operators. I think, in fact, I do believe that there have been a couple of groups that have been identified that participate in ransomware software creation that have been sanctioned. I think the difficulty and why we don't see as much of them is oftentimes, the creator of these ransomware softwares, oftentimes they sell it online and they themselves are not identified. And, for the OFAC to actually sanction an organization or individual, they must have a name or a legal entity to impose those sanctions upon. And so with something like a crypto mixer or an exchange, there's usually a legal entity behind that they can identify. Whereas with ransomware operators, to the extent that, they operate behind a pseudonym, or to the extent that they simply release the software online, it can be much more difficult for these regulators to identify who in particular entity or individual they should impose those sanctions on. Now that being said, what Merkle Science can usually do and how we typically work with partners Black Panda and Dwayne Morris is in the event of an incident, like what Chris and David had alluded to, time is usually of the essence. And so it's very important for, I think, any business to recognize that a risk of a ransomware attack is real. I think oftentimes what we see and why companies suffer so much from these attacks is that when they happen, these companies are not prepared, right? I think most people never imagine that a ransomware attack would happen to themselves, right? And so they don't have the proper processes in place, the proper training in place. And in the event that something happens, they spend a lot of time trying to identify who can assist them. And, the good thing is, most cybersecurity firms like Black Panda, they're full suite, which means that they can help organizations with everything from the prevention side, as well as after the incident, right? And, that's then where partnerships with legal firms who can then issue subpoenas in a timely manner becomes vital.
That's great. Thank you for that, Ian. And I think it brings up an interesting point that really beyond ransomware, there are lots of other crypto crime, but also security issues that companies need to be aware of. From your perspective, Ian, what are the major trends as a solution provider in this space?
I think one thing that we've seen a rise in, especially in the last year, is an increase in phishing attacks and scams, right? I mean, definitely, we still see the hacks on the large exchanges, but I think what's more concerning to us is, again, the rise in attacks at individuals, right? And this is especially because, in the last year itself, we saw an entirely new demographic of users in the crypto space enter into the market, right? Especially with the rise in popularity amongst NFTs and DeFi, we see all kinds of, artists, individuals, investors coming into the space. And these new entrants have not been exposed to, the space long enough to understand the risk or to how to manage their private keys appropriately. And so we are getting a lot of requests from individuals who've fallen victims to these attacks, and they really have no idea, what happened, what caused it, and how they should even go about trying to recover their assets. And with that being said, one of the things that I am very happy to see happening is, again, we see more regulations coming in, more businesses being expected to put in place proper KYC measures, AML measures, TRM measures to help guard against these attacks. So hopefully, as the industry bands together and actively fight against such actors, we will see a decrease in crime. But I think probably a few years off from that, we're probably going to see an increase before things get better.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really good point, Ian, that, we see businesses within the space, either crypto native businesses like CoinHacker or crypto businesses with crypto exposure, really trying to implement best in class solutions to prevent crypto crime, to ensure the consumers are protected. And certainly CoinHacker, is a great example of that. So Pasi, from your side, you've received, recognition from MAS in terms of your approach to compliance and consumer protection. What are you seeing as trends in your space, and what are your consumers concerned about?
Well, the question about trends, maybe I think the biggest mega trend over here in our space is the increase of regulation. We do have the acute, they call it crypto winter, I believe, currently, although it seems to be currently a bit evening out. Who knows where it's going? Financial advice for that from me. I'm not a licensed to give any. For the previous comments about the individual perspective, consumer protection has always been very important pillar for our company, and I think that's the reason why we were the first crypto exchange here in Singapore that was licensed by MAS. There are other applicants, of course, but we are just the first one to reach that major milestone. We've been also working really closely with the local law enforcement to help the victims of different scams and attempts and blocking them. So consumer and investor protection is very central to our business type. If I remember right, we were able to return more than 13 million Sing dollar last year alone to the victims of scams, or prevent them. So the value that we are able to prevent or return is very significant. We have received some prizes as well for that from local authorities. Really proud about our risk management team there. We do also have that role of protection of all of the assets going through our platform. So it does mean that we have to monitor the risk as well by using some sort of service that allows us to know which actors on the crypto market are good and bad, and if there are blacklisted wallet addresses and so on and so forth. So an exchange has a lot of these responsibilities that come inherently, some of them from ethics and business ethics, some of them from local regulation. So I think there's a question about that as about the MAS for a recognition. So I think the answer is yes, we do comply with the local requirements by MAS. That's part of the envelope.
100%.
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's come to the top of the hour all too quickly, as I knew that it would. It is definitely a topic that can be discussed for many, many hours. Thank you everyone, particularly to our panelists and to our audience for joining us today. As I mentioned at the top of the call, we will absolutely be sharing it with everyone who's registered and everyone who's attended, and we'll make sure that the contact information of all of our speakers is available should you want to get in touch. But thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Natalie.
Everyone, yes.
Bye.
Bye-bye.